Good morning, everyone. Today we have with us Professor Janet Blake. She is an associate professor of law at the University of Tehran, where she teaches international environmental and human rights law. She is also a member of the Cultural Heritage Law Committee of the International Law Association and has acted as an international consultant to UNESCO since 1999, mostly in the field of ACH and implementing the 2003 Convention. She has published a lot of books and articles on safeguarding ACH and cultural rights and diversity. Thank you so much for being here with us, Professor Janet Blake. I give you the floor.
Well, thank you very much for your introduction, and my thanks also to the UNESCO chair at Sapienza University in Rome for inviting me to take part in this very interesting series of talks. Before I start to speak about Iran, I would really like to, first of all, share my congratulations to everybody involved with the 2003 convention for its 20th birthday, and to share a few highlights of the 2 decades of the first 2 decades of its life. First of all, I think, as somebody involved in the initial development of the treaty, maybe today it looks quite without question that we take a cultural approach to protecting this area of heritage. But at the time of developing the treaty, this was not nearly so clear. And there was a lot of discussion as to whether it should be a narrower intellectual property approach. And I think that the experience of the convention shows how very positive the choice for a cultural approach has been. Second, the whole notion that we talk now about safeguarding, not a narrower concept of protection, something which speaks to the fact that we're not just directly focusing on particular elements of heritage, but much more importantly, we are safeguarding the heritage within the human context, the context of the human society, that is absolutely essential for its continued viability. Third, the fact that when we started out, honestly, it wasn't clear what intangible cultural heritage might comprise and what domains it was found in, and that the operation of the convention has helped considerably to make that much clearer and clearer for each country, because this is a very specific fact for each country and even each locality within a country. There has been a hugely important paradigm shift from a state-driven model of protection to one which is much more about involving and the really active engagement and participation of the communities, groups, and individuals who are mentioned in the convention in this whole project. And that really has been a fundamental shift, which is also impacting on other areas of heritage too now. Lastly, the way that this heritage and its safeguarding has been directly connected with sustainable development is also a very powerful expression of that relationship. And I think it's one of the earliest places that we found it articulated in any kind of treaty text. And all of these have been, I think, quite exciting to watch over the years, how they have developed. But now I'm going to move to the specific question I was asked to talk about, which is about the implementation of the convention within Iran. So first of all, intangible cultural heritage in Iran. I mean, what is its character? It's very rich and varied, because this is a country with many different ethnic groups, as well as tribal and nomadic peoples alongside the urban residents, and also many different regions geographically and in terms of climate and general environmental context. And even sometimes the specificities can be at the level of a single village compared with the next village along. Also, we should, however, mention that until really very recently, the focus on heritage, and I say heritage protection and recognition in Iran, has been predominantly on the more monumental heritage, such as Persepolis, the central square, the Naqsh Jahan in Esfahan, and the movables such as the sculptures from the Achaemenid era. And that has been very much the way that the country has seen its heritage until pretty recently. And also, this physical material heritage has very much been used as a way of projecting the political identity of the country. So, for example, when we had the Shah and his regime until 1979, then it was very much about the Achaemenid ancient Persia, which was speaking to a kind of mythical notion of the Pahlavi dynasty. And then subsequently, it's the Islamic Safavid architecture that you find in Esfahan, for example, which has very much been the identity of this country, but very much fixed more on the physical, the material, than the intangible heritage. It's only very recently we're now giving more importance to the latter. And the 2003 convention has been crucial in that fact. But before we get to looking at the actual implementation of the convention, I think it's important to note that as in many countries and languages, translating the fundamental concepts of the convention can be problematic. So, for example, although the official translation of intangible cultural heritage into Persian, which is Miras-i Farhangi Namalmus, is relatively close to the original notion, particularly in English, i.e., some form of cultural heritage that you can't touch. At the same time, there are a lot of people, including people who work in the heritage administration, universities, experts and others, who tend to prefer the phrase Miras-i Ma'anavi, which is kind of a notion of spiritual heritage. And at the same time is also rather connected to the notion of intellectual property in Persian and Arabic too. And you can see therefore how the use of that second phrase can cause some problems in terms of limiting the scope of what the convention might be doing. Safeguarding, again, yes, we do have a term in Persian, pasdari, which essentially is very similar to the idea of safeguarding. But at the same time, it's not uncommon for the word hefazat, which is much more the word protection, to be used. And so there's still work to be done in terms of educating people about the notions of the convention. We also have in Iran the concept of the master, and that's usually how it's translated into English. So we have male and female masters, Ostad, who are those particular exponents that have a very high level of knowledge that they then pass on to their pupils or apprentices using a traditional method of transmission, and that they are actually recognized, as we will see later, in the legal context of implementing the convention in Iran. Lastly, I want to draw attention to the bottom paragraph in this slide, which mentions, and these executive regulations of the legislation actually describe who the stakeholders and actors are. And it's rather interesting because it includes amongst them nomads, peoples, communities, social groups, and individuals who have created, maintained, and transmitted the intangible heritage over the past or into the present time. And so you see, it's a rather culture and country-specific understanding of these stakeholders, which reminds us that this is a multi-stakeholder convention, and that for each country in each context, the range of stakeholders are going to be different. Now, before the convention was adopted, and certainly before it was ratified by Iran, Iran already had several decades of experience of anthropological and related ethnographic research, documentation, recording of what we now understand to be elements of intangible cultural heritage. And of course, therefore, the positive of this is there does exist a large body of research. And, you know, this was conducted predominantly by universities and research institutes, but also some of it by specialist NGOs, such as the Association of Traditional Music in the country, or the Association of Traditional Medicine, as well as municipalities and other local organizations. And so we do have a wealth of that kind of knowledge, but on a less positive level, this knowledge that was gathered wasn't gathered within the framework of the convention. It was gathered with quite different purposes and intentions, and very much it's descriptive. It describes the elements. It's not concerned particularly with the question of, how do you safeguard this? How do you safeguard its communities? And how do you ensure that safeguarding itself has positive impacts, which is where we are now today. And it's also very much researcher driven, in that the community participation model of the convention in that older research, doesn't really feature. But again, what has been positive about this is that research conducted more recently in relation to elements that have been inscribed, particularly on the international lists of the convention, has definitely drawn people's attention towards the whole notion of intangible cultural heritage. And this is a concept which does speak directly to people, because traditional culture and traditional cultural practices, including many rituals, are extremely important today to people's everyday lives in Iran. Now, just at the bottom of this slide, I mentioned that in 2016, a research was conducted, a sort of review of the research in this area, and it counted that there were approximately 1,000 relevant research studies undertaken in Iran, which covered very different aspects of intangible cultural heritage, such as folk medicine, tribal cultures, local fables, lullabies, traditional games, water rituals, and beliefs associated with water. So a very wide range of types of intangible cultural heritage that has been studied in the country. So now we come to the implementation from a legal legislative framework point of view in Iran. I start with the constitutional law because it does have aspects that are relevant to this question. Now, the constitution that we now have was adopted initially in 1979 following the Islamic Revolution, and amended 10 years later in 1989. And of course, the rights and duties are framed within an overarching framework of Islamic law. But within that framework, the Constitution does address a number of relevant rights, such as the rights of ethnic communities, the protection of languages and dialects, and cultural rights. Equally, although there is one school of Islam, Shia tradition, which is particularly protected under the Constitution, other followers of different Islamic traditions, as well as of Zoroastrian, Jewish, and Christian religious minorities, they are recognized also and are free to perform their religious rites and ceremonies and to follow their traditions within their religious context. And so, of course, this speaks again to a large part of the intangible cultural heritage in the country. Equally, all Iranians, irrespective of their ethnic group or their tribe, and so this includes tribal peoples and the speakers of dialects as well as minority languages, they enjoy equal rights under the constitutional law. The existing and the current antiquities legislation, which governs protection of all cultural heritage in Iran, dates back to 1935. And although there have been executive regulations adopted over time to try to bring it more up to date, it clearly is out of date. It contains elements that are no longer appropriate to cultural heritage in general. And of course, since Iran became a party to the 2003 convention, that is even more the case. And so the question that's now facing lawmakers in this country is, should this law be revised to bring it up to date? and amongst other things to include intangible cultural heritage more directly and appropriately? Or in fact, do we really need to have one new law covering, as it were, the physical, tangible cultural heritage, and another specific law for intangible cultural heritage? And this is a discussion which is ongoing in the country and is not yet resolved. So, given that this existing act is really pretty obsolescent in many ways, obviously it may be advisable just to start from scratch and draft a new piece of legislation. We do also have an act of accession of Iran to the 2003 Convention, which was enacted at the end of 2005. Iran became a party officially in 2006 adopted by the Islamic Consultative Assembly, which is the parliament here. But this act doesn't really do more than simply incorporate the convention into national legislation, and in other words, create the general duty to implement the convention's obligations, such as they are. And so what we also have from 2009 are a set of executive regulations for ICH, which essentially set out in much more detail what the country needs to do in order to implement the convention. And they comprise 15 articles, which set out this framework for implementation. Interestingly enough, it requires 10 national bodies that are competent in the field of culture to cooperate together with the Ministry of Cultural Heritage, Handicrafts and Tourism in order to achieve the objectives of the convention. So already in a way we start with this idea that implementing this convention is a fairly broad approach in terms of governmental institutions. And it should be mentioned that the founding statute of this ministry, which was founded as an organization within the presidential office and has more recently become a ministry, that this includes, amongst its duties, to conduct anthropological surveys and identify the vernacular culture of the country. So this would speak directly to intangible cultural heritage, as well as to conduct research into traditional arts and create better conditions for their preservation, revitalization, and improvement. So again, all of this is very much within the notion of safeguarding of the 2003 Convention. Also, very interestingly, there are further regulations that have actually established both an ICH expert committee, which has been involved in advising on, say, the inventorying system that has been established, and also is the committee that actually advises on the inscriptions to the national inventories. There's also, and this is really rather interesting, an interagency body bringing together ministries with relevant organizations such as the Environmental Protection Organization to liaise over ICH safeguarding. So on paper, it's really a very enlightened approach, which does recognize the multi-sectoral character of implementation. Of course, as we know, in reality, bringing together different governmental agencies and ministries is not the easiest thing in the world. So how it operates on the ground sometimes is not quite as successful as the ambition on paper. If we look at the question, what does the notion of intangible cultural heritage include or cover within the legislative context of Iran? The point to make first is that the executive regulations themselves do not define ICH per se, but what they do, they set out the domains in which it is found, predominantly according to the 5 domains set out in the 2003 Convention, although under the second domain B, which is ritual, social practices, etc., it also includes athletic arts as a kind of local specificity in Iran. Also, it's important to note that language itself in Iran is seen essentially as an intangible cultural heritage. It's not seen purely as a vehicle for ICH, which is what the convention does. Rather, it's accorded a much higher importance. And for example, there has been a lot of work carried out over a number of years in creating an atlas of Iran's languages and the dialects as well, which is again interesting that it's not just separate languages, but also dialects that are recorded in Iran. Equally, as I mentioned before, spiritual heritage is accorded great importance in Iran. But not only that, this importance is not restricted solely to, let's say, the rituals associated with religious belief, but in a sense, the religious beliefs themselves become seen as the intangible heritage, which again is a certain diversion from the way the convention was conceived initially by its drafters. And a further specificity in Iran, which is found in some other countries, especially in this region, is the idea that elements which are no longer practiced or enacted or performed, but which remain in the memories of people, also can be counted as intangible cultural heritage here, which is something, again, rather different from the approach of the convention. So we have the question of, who does what in terms of implementing the convention under our legislation. First of all, there is an Office for Inscription of Intangible and Natural Heritage within the Ministry of Cultural Heritage. And interestingly, intangible heritage has been brought together with natural heritage. That is the body that, for example, administers the inventories and generally implements the 2003 convention. And it operates through 31 provincial directorate generals of the Ministry of Cultural Heritage. So there is this kind of devolved approach also that you see at the level of the provinces around the country. But there are also other governmental bodies implicated that are mentioned in the additional regulations that I pointed to above, which include not just a research center attached to the ministry, but also the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance, Ministry of Science and Higher Education, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Youth and Sport, Ministry of Information, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the academies of both arts and Persian language, and the State TV and Radio Organization. So it is a pretty broad approach across different sectors of government and agencies of government. At the same time, there are also 200 non-governmental organizations that are listed within the Ministry of Cultural Heritage as partners with the Office for Inscription in implementing the convention. Although I really have to say that up until now, their role in this has been pretty limited, but certainly one or two of the associations, for example, Association of Traditional Music, have contributed to developing nomination files for international inscription. Also, the Ministry of Cultural Heritage does train public servants in other areas of government. And also there's other training going on from other different entities in the country. As I mentioned, inventorying. Now, inventorying in Iran is probably up until now still one of the major aspects of internal implementation. And so I'm focusing on this to a large degree. The first thing that is interesting to note is that Iran has established 5 national lists. So the first is known as the representative list, and therefore it's parallel with the idea of the international representative list. And the second, similarly, list of ICH in need of urgent safeguarding. And the criteria that they apply are rather similar to those that are advised for the international inscriptions. Then there's a list of ICH in need of revitalization. So that recognizes, of course, that some elements their viability is very threatened and they need very particular interventions to safeguard them. So all of those were created in 2007 within a year of ratification. Then you have three more. The first two were created in 2007. And then you have the three last ones, the one I've just mentioned, and two more that were established in 2016. So you see that there was an understanding of a kind of gap here, that there was a need for a broader approach to inventory. And so apart from the list of ICH in need of revitalization, you also had a list of identification and primary documentation. In other words, that is actually focusing on that aspect of how, what tools do you use for identification documentation? And the last is an interesting one too, that a national inventory of living human treasures was also established at the time, which of course speaks to what I said before, that this is one of many countries where we have a very well-established traditional system of transmission from a master to a student to an apprentice. And it recognizes the role of those masters. It also is interesting because at the time of drafting the convention, this idea was definitely around, but the decision was taken not to include such a tool within the convention framework itself, but a large number of countries around the world have chosen to follow this. So criteria for inscription on particularly the first list, include the social cultural value that the elements have for the bearers themselves, that they're transmitted intergenerationally using traditional modes of transmission, and also that they are recognized by the communities as representative of their heritage. So all of that is very much replicating some of the criteria for the representative list itself. And the viability of the elements we've seen is considered, and now we have that separate inventory for those that require a lot of intervention. The National Living Human Treasures Inventory requires that these particular exponents of the ICH, that they have excellence in their practical application of their knowledge, that they show a dedication to that specialist area. In other words, it's not just a kind of hobby they have, but it really is an important part of their lives. And that they are unique in some sense, that they have a range of knowledge and skills that others don't have. And they have the ability to develop it further, but also to transmit it to their trainees. And all of these are required. And those exponents that are inscribed on this inventory do also receive some kind of salary. They receive some, I think, insurance support. And so there is a definite advantage to the exponents of this heritage to be chosen as living human treasures. So to get an idea of the scope and extent we're talking about, by 2016, there were a total of 1,350 elements inscribed from across Iran on these first two inventories. And they covered the following domains in the following percentages, which is quite interesting to see. That social practices, rituals, and festivals were nearly 40% of the total. Traditional handicrafts, 36%. And then we have the performing arts at 11.5%, knowledge about nature and the universe at about 10%, and oral expressions known as folk literature as just 3%. Now, this does not reflect the actual reality on the ground, because there's a huge amount of oral traditions and folk literature in Iran. It rather reflects the attention that is given to these different elements and these different domains of ICH in Iran. Now, my last two slides are looking then at the international actions within the framework of the Convention of Iran. And I ask the question in this slide, an exercise in soft power. Because the fifth five-year National Development Plan, which was adopted in 2009, permitted the ministry, that is the Ministry of Cultural Heritage, to identify and protect intangible cultural heritage belonging to the neighboring countries and the region, also other countries of the world. So this suggests very much that ICH was being perceived as a means of a kind of exercise of soft power beyond the frontiers of the country. It also, of course, recognizes the fact that the area that was under the political control of Iran in the past was a much greater area. And so there is a definite sort of cultural geographic zone where there are a lot of related elements of intangible cultural heritage with those that are also in Iran. And we can see that this way of thinking and this approach very much underpinned the development of the multinational nomination of Nowruz, the Persian New Year, which now has 12 member countries since 2016. So it is a very extensive multinational nomination that was led by Iran. At the same time, Iran does cooperate closely, for example, with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, and the Economic Cooperation Organization, ECO, in the field of ICH, and has also acted as a member of the Intergovernmental Committee for Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage within the framework of the Convention. In addition, Iran hosts, I think it is since 2010, if I'm correct, a regional research center for safeguarding intangible cultural heritage in West and Central Asia, which is a Category 2 center of UNESCO, and so is the Category 2 center in a sense that serves the countries of Western and Central Asia particularly. So Iran has definitely been active in engaging internationally with regard to this convention. And also you could argue that some of the choices about the international inscriptions from Iran may to some degree be a further exercise in soft power. Or let's put it another way, they answer to certain requirements of the country. I haven't listed them all here, but if we look at some of the 13 elements on the representative list, well, we see the Radif of Iranian music, which it's interesting because an awful lot of our neighboring countries also actually follow this musical tradition. We have two examples of traditional skills of carpet weaving, one from Kashan and one from Fars province. And that's very much, I think, a kind of defensive form of listing, which is to try to prevent the production and the sale of machine-made carpets using these, particularly the designs of these carpets. By putting the name of the carpet design in the inscription, it tends to suggest there is something a bit defensive about that action as well. The ritual dramatic art of the ta'ziyeh, it speaks to probably one of the most central rituals of the Shia Islamic tradition, and therefore, of course, you could understand it as also speaking to the cultural and religious identity of the country. The Pahlavani and Zurkhane rituals are that this is the traditional and ancient tradition of a kind of exercise using different sort of heavy weights and things, and it's something that goes back to the ancient culture of the country. Then the music of the Bakshis of Khorasan. This is one interesting one because here we're showing a particular ethnic group which is being recognized. And I think that's an important point to make. That it's not simply about the sort of Persian view of the Iranian culture, but something that does include other ethnicities. I mentioned already the Nowruz file with all of these countries involved. And the next one is an interesting one, the flatbread making and sharing culture, which is a joint nomination with Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkey, because in many ways this one was rather responsive to the fact that I think it was in the previous year Armenia had inscribed lavash, flatbread, as an Armenian element. And so you can see how you also get within the representative list a degree of competition appearing as well at times, particularly between regional countries with fairly shared heritage. And the next one also, Chogan, a horse riding game, because this is the polo that is very much associated with the, for example, Safavid era in Iran, and the central square of Esfahan being used as a polo field in the 16th century. But again, it responds also to the fact that polo from other neighboring countries have previously been inscribed. And the art of the miniature, I mean, miniatures again is one of those elements that is shared among so many of the neighboring countries. But the last one is also interesting, which is with Armenia. It concerns a pilgrimage tradition to the Saint Thaddeus Apostle Monastery, in other words, an Armenian Christian monastery in northern Iran. Again, to show an attempt to show broader conception here, not just an Islamic country, but an Islamic country that extends a high degree of tolerance towards those recognized minority faiths within Iran. But you see how in some ways many of these are giving certain messages internationally. And this is not just Iran. I think it's true of just about every member, every state party when it is nominating an element for inscription. We also have two on the urgent safeguarding list. One which concerns a dramatic storytelling element, Naqali, which is an interesting one because traditionally this has been a male-only element of telling stories from the Shahnameh in tea houses. But over recent years, we now have women also proponents of Naqal. And the traditional skills of building and sailing, including navigation skills, of the Iranian lenja boats in the Persian Gulf, the traditional wooden boats of Iran in the Persian Gulf. And lastly, in 2021, the first good safeguarding practice that has been inscribed for Iran, a national program to safeguard the traditional art of calligraphy in Iran, which speaks very much, of course, to safeguarding the transmission of that particular art, or that ICH element. So I hope in this talk I have managed to just give you a brief overview, not only of the legislative system, but also slightly more broadly, both the intellectual, the cultural context within which that is happening in Iran. Thank you very much.